Hello, I'm Anna Dean, and this is my M.F.A. thesis exhibition entitled Dust and Shadow. This entire body of work was an investigation into ideas about order and chaos. And I chose that topic because this particular moment in time feels incredibly chaotic to me. And so I wanted to understand why. And so I wanted to look deeper into ideas about chaos and order. And I wasn't only looking at visual artists that are investigating those ideas, I also looked into other disciplines, such as science and math, physics and thermodynamics. And as I began to investigate chaos in the natural world and chaos within society, there was one major thread that ran throughout all of that, and that was the concept of entropy. Entropy, in a nutshell, is the amount of disorder within a system. So once upon a time, the universe was this really hot, dense ball of stuff. And it was very orderly because it was so compact that there was only one way that it could be arranged. So it had very low entropy. And then the Big Bang happened, and the universe started breaking down, and it started speeding away from the pieces started speeding away from each other at an ever-increasing rate. So right now we're hurtling through the galaxy on this hunk of space dust that's expanding faster and faster and faster. And so that concept was just really fascinating to me. It's not only happening at the macrocosmic level in the cosmos, but entropy also is happening here on Earth. So there are these mountains, and glaciers are receding, and they are breaking apart these mountains into boulders, which then get broken down and carried downstream and turned into rocks, and eventually they crumble apart into sand and they're deposited in the sea. And so if entropy was allowed to continue, if time continued, eventually the Earth would be this homogeneous flat landscape. There'd be no more peaks or valleys. Everything would just be broken down into these pieces that are mixed up together, creating this flat, bland landscape. A whole lot of noise and not a lot of signal. So that concept is really, really fascinating to me. There were two theorists that had a big impact on my work. And one of those was Robert Smithson, who you may know from the spiral jetty. It wasn't necessarily his artwork that inspired me, it was really more his writings. And then there was a book by Rudolf Arnheim called Entropy and Art. And so they wrote not only about entropy happening at the macrocosmic level and happening here on Earth, but both Smithson and Arnheim both discussed how entropy is also happening within society. And Robert Smithson in particular talks about how that is evidenced through society's increasing acceptance of fake materials. Our acceptance of naugahyde rather than leather, our acceptance of fake wood as opposed to real wood, fake stone instead of real stone. So that was really interesting because we live in this moment of fake news where we're really struggling to find out what is true. And so that thread of entropy, particularly as it relates to society, that was one major thread of my research. The other thread related to Jean Baudrillard's landmark article, Simulacra and Simulation. And in that article, he talks about how we're living in a simulation. We're living in a copy of 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 something that once was truth, but we've become so many iterations away from that we live in a simulacra that's no longer attached to that original reality. And so those two threads of my research, dust and shadow, dust coming from the end result of entropy, when things have broken down to the point that they can't be broken down any longer, they become dust. And shadow as a reference to an iteration away from the truth. So your shadow on the ground is one level away from yourself, right? That's one step toward the simulacra. And that's sort of also a reference to Plato's allegory of the cave and how he talks about these people that are trapped in this cave and they've never seen the real world. They've only seen the shadow that's being cast on the back of the cave wall, and they accept that as truth. So this search for truth, while the world is breaking down, while the universe is breaking down, that's really what this entire body of work is about. This piece was the first piece that I created in this series of work, and this actually began as a drawing. I was teaching a 2D media studies course, and we were working on drawings from sourced imagery, and so I had this book of aerial photos, and there was one particular photo of polar ice breaking down, and so I laid a sheet of Mylar over that, and I began tracing not just the ice chunks themselves, but actually the spaces in between the ice chunks. Always for me, the space in between things has always seemed more interesting than the positive space itself. So anyway, I was tracing these shapes, and when I was finished, I lifted up the drawing, and it had become something else. It was no longer just polar ice. It had become sort of like this Milky Way galaxy, or maybe like a spine with vertebrae. And one thing I've really tried to focus on during my time here at grad school is to understand and pay attention when the universe is trying to tell me something. So there was something in that drawing that I needed to investigate more. So I've probably made 30 different iterations of that drawing. I've made prints of it, I've made paintings of it, and so I wanted to make it actually exist in space, and I wanted to be able to walk through these pieces. And so I made these pieces out of porcelain. It became really important to me that I did not create these shapes with my own hands. I wanted them to be naturally formed. And so I could have just taken a big piece of porcelain tile and busted it with a hammer, but I didn't want to do that because that would have been my hand impacting the shapes. So what I did was mix up a porcelain slip, which is like a really watery slurry of porcelain clay, and I poured it over these big pieces of plaster. And plaster is really porous, so it sucked up all the water. And it made, through the process of dehydration, all of these shapes were formed. So I very carefully picked them up and put them in the kiln, probably made 20 batches of those pieces. And I originally had them hanging in my studio. I wanted them to like levitate like eggshells, but unfortunately we live on Earth where we have gravity, which is sometimes a bummer, and so I could never get them to do what I wanted. They just looked really saggy and sad. And so I had them mounted on this piece of acrylic, and they were propped up in my studio, and I projected this film, and somehow it began to say what I was something that I was trying to get across. And it became much more interesting. So I ended up making this is an 8-foot tall steel grid. I welded that, and then I ran these monofilament grids across. And grids are another important theme that runs through all of this work. A grid is a human construct. Grids don't really exist in the natural world. We are in a grid right now, and you probably aren't even thinking about it, but you're in a box, inside of another box. You look out the window, there's a grid there. You look through the window, and then there's a screen on the window, so it's another grid. And you're sitting in your grid, looking out the window at your neighbors through their grids, and the only thing in between these grids is clouds or a tree branch or something from the natural world that breaks up that grid. So that juxtaposition and that collision of man-made and the natural environment is an important thread that goes through all of this work. So you'll see the grid repeated a lot. The video that's being projected, my family and I are big into national parks and big hikers. We love being outside. So we went on a big national park trip last summer, and I videotaped. We hiked up to glaciers, and I taped the water melting off the glacier, and I videotaped the water as it ran down through the streams and the rivers, and we went all the way to Olympic National Park and watched the sand getting deposited in the sea. And so I wanted to incorporate that process, but I wanted to make it one step away from the real and one step toward the simulacra. So when I recorded it, I already was one iteration away from what was truth. But then I made it symmetrical, because according to my research, human beings find order within symmetry because our bodies have symmetry. So when you look at this film, there's something really bodily about it, and I think that's why, because we have bilateral symmetry within our own bodies, so we recognize that. You can take the most chaotic, scribbly mark, and when you make it symmetrical, somehow it makes sense, and people start to see faces, or they start to identify with it. So symmetry is another important thread that runs through this, and the idea of duality. So that's what this film is. I also amped up the color and the contrast because I wanted it to be more hypercolor. I was thinking a lot about society's acceptance of fake nature. How many people do you know that go to Disney World every year because they want to see a fake, really safe version of America, but they may not venture, a few miles away into the woods to see the natural aspects of our country. So that's something that I was thinking a lot. So this piece is called palimpsest, and that term refers to back when paper was more scarce. People would write a manuscript and then they would scrape it away and put the next manuscript on top, scrape it away, put the next manuscript on top, each time leaving a little bit of a trace of the previous information. So it became this like stratification of all this data, and because the trace that was left behind became a part of the next layer of the work. And so that's kind of what this piece is about. I go back and forth a lot between 2D and 3D. It's a very different way of thinking about information. 3D, I'm having to think about materials and like structural integrity and is it going to collapse on my head. 2D allows me to kind of, it's more of like a brainstorming space, and each type of work informs the other. But this piece was just a big space for me to investigate ideas about order and chaos. This is 12 by 8 feet, and that's the exact same size as the projection on the other side of the gallery. You probably recognize these shapes. This is a wooden version exactly of the porcelain pieces that are on the piece we just looked at, surface tension. And so the way I created that, those porcelain pieces were caused by nature. They were naturally forming shapes, and so I took a photo of those and I traced them very painstakingly using Adobe Illustrator. I broke them down into 1 foot squares to make a grid, and then I cut them out using a laser cutter. So that's something else that's important to all of this work, is not only am I interested in the collision of the natural world and the man-made world, I'm also really interested in the collision of the handmade and the computer-generated artwork. And so that's something that I incorporate a lot in my work. So these are the exact mirror of the porcelain shapes on the other side of the room. Also the grids. The grid that you see here is a screenshot of the video on the other side of the room, and it's a Epson large format print, so it's an archival print, and I cut that down into all these pixels, and this was cut by hand. So it took me a really long time to cut it out, but as I was cutting, it allowed me the time to think about how, even though this seems like it took a really long time, it didn't take as long as the river took to break down the rock into sand. So I was breaking down the things that break things down, which is really interesting. And I was creating pixels, and this was already pixelated because it was a screenshot of film. So I was making pixels out of pixels. So that was interesting. Kind of the concept behind these 3 panels is this was an investigation into order and chaos at the macrocosmic level. This was an investigation of order and chaos in the man-made world. And this is an investigation of order and chaos at the microcosmic level. So this drawing here that's on Mylar was a recreation of the gravitational pull of the Milky Way galaxy. And then this one was a crowdsourced shape that was given to me by my friends on social media. They all gave me a letter and a number, and I plotted it on a grid, and then I created this shape. So all these white shapes that you see, those were crowdsourced shapes. And it's interesting because they kind of look like they're this viral spread that's taken over everything, which is really fascinating when you think about the state of the Earth right now and how we're in this coronavirus and the interconnectedness of people and how fast things can travel. Especially this is social media. You know, I had friends all over the world that were giving me their letters and numbers, and I was able to communicate with them instantly, which is really fascinating to me. This is the drawing here on the Mylar, was a microscopic photo of human tears, and then it was zoomed in, zoomed in, zoomed in. So I traced human tears at the microcosmic level, and that's what that drawing is about. The data that's down here on the bottom also relates to that. So this is the redshift expansion that explores and investigates how the universe is expanding since the Big Bang. This is a sort of triangulation map of the Dead Sea and thinking about how humans use the stars to navigate and understand where they're at on the Earth. And then this was a grid about a cell breaking down. So macro, man, micro. Speaking of humans understanding a sense of scale, let's go back to the grid for a second, because I mentioned about the grid and its importance in human architecture, but the grid is also a way humans understand their relationship to the universe and to the Earth. The Earth can seem like this really big, vast place, and we can seem really, really small. But as soon as you begin to make a map and you use horizontal and vertical lines of latitude and longitude, all of a sudden you've brought the Earth down to human scale, because we can understand our relationship to that space. So a grid also, the idea of scale is another thing that I've been thinking about a lot, and how humans relate to the vastness of the cosmos. This is meant to be interactive, but since I'm the only one here due to coronavirus, I'll just show you. You can pull these plumb bobs back, and there's a sound element. I was researching about how the planets all have their own vibration, and in theory you could actually play the universe, or play our solar system, and it could play like a chord. And so that was really interesting to me, that we're all on this space dust rock that's humming. So the idea of sound has been really important, and something that I'd love to investigate more. I didn't mention, but in the piece that we just looked at on the other side of the room, that sound element was created by my friend Jeff Holland, who's an incredible musician, and he helped me, and he made the sounds that you heard, and he was pouring water into bowls, but he was also using instruments like rain sticks and chimes to kind of give his impression of water breaking down stones. And so that's something I'm really interested in, is incorporating as many different disciplines as possible. Working with other artists is really, really exciting to me, and something that I would love to do more of in the future. This piece is called Cloud Architecture, and this was really an intense investigation into that Baudrillard article that I was talking about earlier, simulacra and simulation. I was thinking about architecture, and I wanted an element of architecture in the space, but I didn't want to be specific and choose, I'm going to recreate the Eiffel Tower, I'm going to recreate the Chrysler building, because all of those specific buildings bring too much specificity. And I wanted just a generic sort of example of human architecture. It all came because on my trip out west, not only were we going to national parks, but we were hopping through cities like Seattle and Portland and San Francisco, and there was just this constant building and destroying and building again of architectural elements. And so I wanted to incorporate that. So I decided to think about the possibility of architecting a cloud. A cloud is this really amorphous shape that's constantly shifting and changing and blowing and dissipating and colliding. And so architecture, you think of it as like this stagnant human element, only it's not, because humans are constantly changing and building on top of things. So that was sort of the idea behind this piece, and so I created an architectural cloud, and I wanted to use construction materials. So these are actually steel grids that are used in concrete work. And so I got them at Lowe's, and I welded them together and then painted them and dripped this epoxy resin smooth on product over them to kind of give this sort of drippy effect. I put mirrors underneath because a mirror is another step away from the real and into the idea of the simulacra. I also put the mirrors on the floor because normally you're looking up at a cloud, but this way you look down at a cloud, and when you do, there's a cloud beneath you and there's a cloud above you, so you're sort of stuck in this in-between liminal space. And it just, I think it gives you an opportunity to think about your time, your relationship to time, your relationship to the natural world. The footage that you're watching was a stop motion video of clouds that I just shot in my backyard. And then I, again, upped the contrast and made it symmetrical, going back to that idea of chaos and order. And the more you look at it, you start to see things, you know, like I see a skull, I see a face, and it's all just because of the way the clouds are symmetrical within this film. This piece is called Ripple Effect. My goal with this piece was I wanted to make a kinetic piece. I wanted to make something that represented man's attempt to control the natural environment. So I created an oil derrick, because if you've ever seen an oil derrick out in a field, they're these like kind of hybrid between a machine and an animal. They look very animalistic. And when you see them out in a field and they're like thrusting into the earth, there's very much a feeling of it's man trying to dominate the natural environment. And so that was what I was trying to capture. I really wanted people to be able to take an action in the work, and so their shadow would become a part of the piece that would give them another chance to think about the effect of humans on the landscape. The whole point of this whole thing was to create these ripples. And I'm a little sad because I didn't really get to completely install this due to the coronavirus, so you can't really tell. There's water in the pan right now, but not ink. But the idea is that this head of the oil derrick would dip down into the water and it would come back up. And I was trying to create an action that could not be controlled, even though the movement is very repetitive. So the movement's going up and down, but each time the ripples look a little bit different. So if I'd had more time, there was supposed to be light reflecting on the water that would cause ripples to be within the video footage. And by the way, the video footage was crowdsourced again by my social media friends. It's all shot out of planes, so I asked all my friends online if they would send me video footage of anything they had shot out the window of planes. So we have everything in this video from Japan, Munich, the Gold Coast, all over the US, Southwest. So it's really exciting to me to think about how connected we are, and when you fly in a plane and you're looking over the natural landscape, it's the clearest way for you to tell the human impact on the natural landscape, because there are these grids where humans have created these structures within the natural landscape, and then you fly over the mountains and there are all these organic forms. So again, the collision of the organic and the man-made, it's really clear when you're flying in a plane. And so there was supposed to be sand on this end and a big pile of sand in there, so that when this machine is going, it is scraping sand off, salt actually, and kicking it back onto this metal plate. But unfortunately, due to the coronavirus, it is what it is right now. Hopefully, I'm really hoping that I'll have another show soon and be able to install all of this properly and get people to come and interact with it. So that's it. Thank you so much for listening to my talk about my show, and hopefully one day someone will see it in actual real life and not just virtually. Hopefully everyone out there will take care, and this will all be over, and I'm sure there are lessons to learn from all of this, and maybe it has something to do with chaos and order. Thank you so much. Have a great day.